Welcome to Three Count Commentaries. We're going to talk about the Ring Boy scandal and the lawsuit therein that was filed on October 23rd, 2024. 5 John Does are suing Vince McMahon, Linda McMahon, TKO, and WWE for negligence involving the Ring Boy scandal, which occurred in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, the first thing that most people popped into people's heads is this case is almost 40 years old. How is this happening? Well, the state of Maryland in 2023, they pulled back any and all time limits or statute of limitations on child sex, child abuse, that sort of thing. So they could file this at any time. Granted, the crime had to have occurred in the state of Maryland, which I believe they claimed 2 instances within the state of Maryland. As usual, we're going to go through the lawsuit. We're not going to go through the entire thing. It's 82 pages. There's a lot of graphic stuff in here, so we're not going to go into that. And we're basically going to talk. I could give you the long and the short of it. The long and the short of it, to be quite honest, is they're claiming that Vince knew about Mel Phillips being a pedophile and allowed him to continue to have access to children. Now, the evidence that Vince knew about this comes from a Phil Mushnick article in which he quotes Meltzer telling him that Vince told Meltzer that Mel Phillips was fired previously because he had a peculiar interest in young boys or something like that. But he ended up bringing him back. So it's the idea that Vince knew that Mel Phillips was a pedophile and allowed him to work in WWE. I don't know how this is going to play out. The Ring Boy scandal is, quite frankly, and I say this without question, the worst thing that has ever occurred in a professional wrestling company. It is the worst. Well, even if the whole Janelle Grant thing seems to be 100% true, this is still the worst because it involves underage children being taken advantage of by elders within a company that attracts young children. If you take into account what the WWE was in the late 80s, early 90s when Vince took over and Hulkamania was running wild, their primary audience was young boys. That gave Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin, and if you want to say Pat Patterson, because he's mentioned in here as well, access to young boys who were excited about being around the product. In this lawsuit, it features things like Mel Phillips taking pictures with the young boys with various props like Iron Sheik's Persian clubs or championship belts, him promising them tickets. It's 99% of this stuff is dumping on Mel Phillips because he's the one that most people cannot defend. Even though Terry Garvin is blamed for some things in here and Pat Patterson is also blamed for some things in here. Most of the lawsuit is about Mel Phillips. So we're going to read the statement of facts, and we're going to read a little bit of the later part, but we're going to start on page 12. Okay? It says, statement of facts. The WWE and the McMahons knew about Phillips' sexual abuse of ring boys but did not take any measures to prevent it or to protect the young boys. Instead, for years, they knowingly allowed Phillips to use the allure and stature of being associated with WWE to lure, recruit, groom, and sexually abuse numerous underage boys. Phillips' sexual assaults occurred not only at the wrestling venues, but also in hotel rooms and other places where Phillips would shuttle the boys in plain sight. Phillips would get completely naked and require the young boys to be naked for extended periods of time, including throughout the night, when they would be coerced to share a bed with Phillips. Phillips would sometimes videotape the assaults. Now, pause right here because the lawsuit claims that WWE was in possession of a tape of Mel Phillips actually molesting one of the young boys, while basically playing with his feet. Now, I do want to say you got to think about these things in a critical way. It is very peculiar for a guy to have a foot fetish. And I wouldn't care if it was just the foot or the hand. You really shouldn't be massaging children. But I don't know if you can just say that his interest, I guess you want to say, isn't just him being gay. Now, this ends up being the big issue here, because if you fire the guy and it turns out that he's not a pedophile, he's just gay, then you got a lawsuit on your hands, because you can't fire for people for being gay. Even back then, you couldn't really. You might be able to get away with it, but sometimes you couldn't. But if you say, well, I'm overreacting, there's nothing in here that says Vince visually saw Mel Phillips or Pat Patterson or Terry Garvin molest a child, or that Linda literally saw Pat Patterson, Terry Garvin, or Mel Phillips molest a child. There's nothing in here that says that. There's a bunch of quotes from like Jake the Snake Roberts and Greg the Hammer Valentine, Tito Santana, etc. Then there's some less than credible people involved with this, which I hate to read these lawsuits, which are real serious stuff. And then you see superstar Billy Graham being quoted because he's a notorious liar, but he's just one person. There's also, some quotes from Bruno Sammartino in here and a bunch of stuff. But ultimately, how much of this, especially the quotes that happened between the years of like 2000 to 2024, stuff that came out in shoot interviews, which is a lot of the stuff quoted is stuff that came out in shoot interviews or things that are written in books or magazines or whatever that came out years later, 30 years later or whatever. How much of that stuff can be verified for real? That's why usually there is a statute of limitations, is because as people get older, their memories fade, and if all you got is eyewitness testimony, or not even, and sometimes not even eyewitness testimony, just witness testimony, then that could change over the years. And then also, since it was 30 years ago, some of the people that you would call as witnesses have passed away. For instance, Sid Vicious, Sid Udy, who recently passed away. He's quoted in here. He's dead. Bruno Sammartino is quoted in here. He is dead. You can't cross-examine these people. So, sure, you want to quote mine them, I guess. But if this thing was to go to trial, which it probably won't, it more than likely won't, how are you going to examine these people to figure out the validity of their quotes? Now, Tito Santana is still alive. Jake the Snake Roberts is still alive. Greg the Hammer Valentine is still alive. Paul Roma is still alive. So there are some people who are still alive. So I guess you got to say, well, you got to take the bitter with the sweet. Some of them are dead. A lot of them are still alive. We'll just cross-examine the people who are still alive, I guess. But you also have to ask the question, how many of these people just heard about what was happening? They didn't actually see anything. And that becomes a bigger issue, because a lot of it is hearsay. And it's unfortunate, but hearsay is not credible. I heard somebody say this. Somebody told me this happened. That's not exactly the most credible stuff in the world, especially if you didn't seek to verify that information. Because if you're sitting around the bonfire with the boys, chit-chatting, how much thought did you really put into it? If you say Mel's hanging around the kids again, you didn't really put too much thought into that. And so much so that they even quote, because I know this was Bixenspan who helped them on this lawsuit, because he's gotten himself into the Rolling Stone, but it's not about him. Ultimately, they even quote the stuff from the TV where the TV shoots where Gorilla Monsoon or whatever make jokes about Mel Phillips on TV. But the jokes were not about him being a pedophile. It'd be about him having a foot fetish. It was kind of like a rib about him having a foot fetish. Now, I'm interested in where this lawsuit goes, but I'm definitely concerned that there's a lot of hearsay in here. And hearsay is great for if you're just doing a video or you're just podcasting or whatever. Hearsay is fine. You don't, nobody needs to, you know, take into account whether somebody is telling the truth or not. It costs you nothing to tell a story. But now you're talking about probably hundreds of millions of dollars in damages that is owed to people who are in their 50s and 60s now. Because this was 40 years ago. Some of these people were 13. Some of them were 16 or whatever. You're talking about a guy who's almost 60. You're talking about life-changing money for this guy, you know, who might have been preyed upon by, you know, one of these fellows. You want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. You want to make sure that justice is served. Now, before I continue reading this, I also want to say there was a hell of a lot in here about Janelle Grant, which raised my eyebrow because I'm like, why are we bringing this up? But it's a part of this whole new lawsuit thing where they talk about the culture around a thing. So they're basically saying that Vince allowed this sort of thing because he was engaging in this sort of thing or all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, there's an attempt to link these two lawsuits. As a matter of fact, not long after this lawsuit dropped, Ann Callis, who was the attorney for Janelle Grant, well, one of the attorneys for Janelle Grant, had a comment already prepared. So there's some collaboration, I think, here. A lot of people think this is a lawfare. I think that the Ring Boy scandal is a thing that needs to be ironed out because it was horrific. Okay? You just can't get away from this. It was horrific. And apparently it took place in multiple states. Now, to get back into the lawsuit, it says, despite the FBI's acquisition of a videotape evidence of Phillips' actions, its conclusions regarding Phillips' inappropriate sexual proclivities, quote, for young boys were not brought primarily due to, quote, no alleged victims willing to admit to or describe the sexual nature of their activity with Phillips. So, this is a giant hurdle in the idea that there was a cover-up. Is that, well, the FBI supposedly had a videotape. The FBI was investigating Vince McMahon anyway for the steroid trial. Because remember, steroids and the sex scandal was around the same time. So the FBI is already digging into WWE for the steroids. And apparently they were in possession of this tape, but they had nobody to complain. Now, of course, everybody knows that there's at least one major complaint, which was Tom Cole. But Tom Cole has passed away. In 2021, he took his own life. He is, of course, mentioned in here, but he is, I don't believe, one of the individuals suing. He, of course, got his settlement way back in the gap, okay? So, it says, fear, shame, and the McMahon strong-arm tactics and legal machinery were overwhelming, keeping even the strongest ring boys silent for decades. It says WWE and the McMahons knew about, tolerated, or at least tactically and arguably expressly approved of a culture of sexual misconduct, particularly via the actions of WWE executives and Vince McMahon himself. Sexual misconduct permeated the organization from the top down and inflicted the organization to its rotten core. Oh, this is very strong language. Of course, then they go into the allegations against Vince, which have nothing to do with this, but again, it's a lawsuit. They're trying to make this as emotional as possible, as manipulative as possible, because it seems like on the merits of the case itself is quite thin. So you have to load it up with emotional stuff, outside information, stuff that happened to other people 40 years after this, apparently. So we're going to go back into the part specifically about the Ring Boys. Because allegations of the Ring Boy abuse were first publicly revealed in 1992 by a pair of Ring Boys, Tom Cole and Chris Loss, in what became known as the Ring Boy scandal. Accusations of sexual abuse were specifically made against Phillips and two other WWE executives, Terry Garvin and Pat Patterson. The accusations led to Phillips and Garvin leaving WWE and Patterson resigning, only to quickly return. It says, following a review of hundreds of pages of court records, Freedom of Information Act requests, and more than a dozen interviews, Business Insider, which is if I remember correctly, this is Bixenspan. I didn't click the link, but something tells me, because Bixenspan wrote another article right after this came out, so something tells me that he's actually quoted in here. Reported that the McMahons, while publicly expressing shock and concern over the Ring Boy allegations, actually knew about and tolerated the abuse for years. It says a former high-level employee claimed it was a crazy time for the companies. The boys the company hired to put up the ring and so forth were being abused by some of the folks who are in the wrestling operation side of things. And then they emboldened it, and it was just generally known by everybody that it was going on. It was a mess. It was an absolute mess. Okay? Then they quote, Sex Lies and Headlock, where Nelson Swegler, a WWE operations manager, says, quote, he remembers walking into a bus and seeing Garvin, whom he found likable, hard at it with the Ring Boy. Everyone knew what was going on, but it was taking someone within the Brotherhood to have moved on it, and none of the people who knew about it moved on it. Now that quote, that's one of the many quotes that's used multiple times in here. So they're using what's called repetition. So you say the same thing over and over and over again. And of course, we already know if you say something again and again and again, people tend to believe it, right? So, but the vagueness of the language, everyone knew it. Everybody knows about this. Everyone knew it. Now we're talking about legal shit, right? Now we're in the legal muck and mire. That vagueness is not really, you have to specifically say that Vince and Linda knew something about this. Which I don't think they showed a lot of. They do have that one quote, which I'm trying to find in here. I'm going to skip over the Superstar Billy Graham stuff. I'm going to skip over. Here it is. This is from the Phil Mushnick article. So it says, quote, Vince McMahon confessed to New York Post columnist Phil Mushnick that he and Linda knew of Phillips's, quote, peculiar and unnatural interest in boys for years. They temporarily fired him for it in 1988. Despite that knowledge, the McMahons knowingly put dozens of ring boys in imminent harm's way by rehiring Phillips just weeks later, with the caveat that Phillips was to steer clear from the kids. Mushnick wrote about the confession in 1992, quoting Mushnick now 2 weeks ago during Pour His Heart Out phone calls. Vince McMahon told West Coast-based journalist Dave Meltzer, then me, that he had let Phillips go 4 years ago because Phillips' relationship with kids seemed peculiar and unnatural. McMahon said he rehired Phillips with the caveat that Phillips steered clear from the kids. So, this does not say that Vince McMahon caught Mel Phillips fondling a boy or anything like that. It says that Vince was suspicious of Mel Phillips and fired him based off his suspicions. But since he couldn't prove anything likely, he brought him back. Or he knew, however you choose to take it. But this doesn't say flatly that Vince McMahon knew that Mel Phillips was videotaping himself molesting young boys and then just let him come back. This statement does not say that, but they mention this multiple times, like it's the most damning of all accusations. But I guess let's see if it works. I personally look at this thing and say, I would certainly be suspicious of somebody who, if I hire you to do a job and you seem to only bring kids around, I would be suspicious of that too. Like, I know that, young boys are very interested in professional wrestling. I get that they might want to put the ring together for a ticket or, let them take pictures, do meet and greets or whatever. But you couldn't find like a 22-year-old that was interested in doing that too. They all have to be 13, 14, 15. I would be concerned about that too. And I would hope Vince would have the common sense to look at this and say, there's a lot of teenage boys around here, you know? But then again, who knows how many boys it was at any given time. We're looking at over the span of years here. You know, maybe it was 2 or 3 boys a night. Maybe it was 4 boys a night. Maybe, you know, we don't know. At least I don't know. So that's the most damning of the accusations in here so far. So they mentioned that Vince McMahon sued Phil Mushnick. And he says, about a year later, on or about February 17, 1993, WWE and Vince McMahon brought a sham lawsuit against Mushnick in the Post. In his sworn deposition testimony, Mushnick described what he said were detailed conversations with McMahon, where Vince acknowledged that he and Linda, quote, had known for some time that Mel had a peculiar and unnatural interest and attachment to children. And as, quote, as we saw him going around with kids, that Linda and I decided that was wrong. Then, of course, he was fired for it, and only to let Phillips return out of pity. And then they actually put as an addendum to this that the McMahons have a pattern and practice of retaliating whenever someone takes action against them in such a way that would make them look bad. The suit against Mushnick was yet another example of the scorched earth practice of harsh retaliation, intended to silence any criticism and to avoid any accountability. It's weird that people can say that you're aiding and abetting pedophiles, but heavens to Betsy, you can't sue them for defamation or anything like that. I wonder how this turned out. Usually newspapers and reporters are almost bulletproof when it comes to defamation, unless you're Alex Jones. Then usually these people get away with all kinds of defamation. So I'm pretty sure this didn't go well for Vince and them at all, if we're being honest. Now, the most interesting bits in here for me were, of course, the photographs. There's pictures of children with like Persian clubs and belts and things of that nature. And it says, below are 3 pictures of Phillips visiting a neighborhood filled with children, using WWE props and gear to lure children to him. This is sick. It's absolutely sick. This is disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. Mushnick then testified, he told me that he was returned by Linda. Vince and Linda returned Phillips to the organization with the caveat that male steer clear of underage boys, stop hanging around kids, stop chasing after kids. So that sounds to me like he didn't want Mel Phillips hanging around kids. Didn't mind hiring them as long as he stayed away from the kids. That didn't sound like somebody who just allowed, child molestation on his watch. But you're supposed to say he knew that Mel Phillips was a pedophile and still let him hang around. Which, again, this is not the same thing. You being suspicious of somebody and saying, stay away from these, what I'm suspicious of. Like if you think somebody's a thief, you keep them away from the cash register. But if some money comes up missing, that might be the first person you look at, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he did it, right? So you have to navigate the real world. In the real world, you can be suspicious of people without, knowing for sure whether they did something or not. And you can act sometimes just on your suspicion. I think that if you were suspicious that he was a pedophile, better safe than sorry. Because this is what happens when you're not safe. And I honestly think that they might have been negligent in terms of not keeping these people that they were suspicious of away from the company. But then again, I have a very different feeling towards things like homosexuality. I don't think that there should have been gay scout leaders in the Boy Scouts. I don't think there should be gay football coaches. I don't think there should be gay basketball coaches. Just like I don't think that men should teach girls gymnastics. I just think that you don't let the wolf in the hen house. That's logic to me. But that is baked into the law as discrimination. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So I understand that as well, but I would have just taken the L and fired the dude for being gay and being around kids. That would just been me. I just take that L. It's a lot better than letting a kid get molested. If I had to make a choice, right? So it says in his deposition, Mushnick testified that he had talked to Vince about other rumored victims of abuse within WWE beyond the two ring boys who went public in 1992. He recalled mentioning a specific name to Vince, a teen boy Mushnick said was referred to within WWE as Mrs. Mel Phillips. As Mushnick remembered it, Vince responded, "That's Mel Phillips' guy, but he has his parents' permission to be with Mel." Well, that's gross. Even with parents' permission, that's extremely gross. That's very weird. It says Mushnick also testified as follows regarding his conversation with Vince McMahon regarding the obvious red flags associated with Phillips transporting a child from upstate New York to Baltimore. So that puts you right smack dab in the middle of Maryland. It says, and then I said to him, you have to have known that Garvin and Patterson and Phillips were doing this because you were on the road, you saw this stuff, you heard this stuff going around. Everyone knows that what was the joking going around about Phillips' foot fetish. Everyone knew that there were kids on the road who didn't belong there. Kids who were probably underage and what they were doing. Why was it important to have a kid from upstate New York in Baltimore? Why didn't you pick up a kid for the night to hold a wrestler's robe in Baltimore? Why did Mel Phillips have to schlep these kids around the country? And what did he say? He said to me, that's why we gotten rid of him. Meaning all three of those guys. He said that's why he had gotten rid of them. So that was the question was being asked. So I'm guessing Phil Mushnick. And the response was he had gotten rid of him. So Mushnick then says, I think Vince is guilty of aiding and abetting the Ring Boy scandal. At best, he's guilty of rank neglect. So I think that there's a pretty good argument here. So a lot of this stuff is really gross. You know, we get into some of the writings and statements of guys like Vince, like Bret Hart and Tito Santana, etc. I'm not going to go through all of that. Billy Graham is a noted liar. I wouldn't go through all that. People like Brickhouse Brown are quoted in here. Very interesting stuff. If you can find the lawsuit, I suggest you read it. It is a compendium of on this whole situation here. John Arezzi's name has come up again. That Abraham Josephine Reisman, who is the tranny, because we talking about people with sexual perversions here. So now we got to talk about a man who thinks he's a woman. But here's the weird thing about Mel Phillips, because they said he had a foot fetish, and they was making fun of him for having a foot fetish. That's different from being a pedophile, because Tony Atlas also has a foot fetish, which is very weird because Mel Phillips is also black. But Tony Atlas is not a pedophile. So you can't make fun of a guy for having a foot fetish, but also thinking that the foot fetish and the pedophilia is the same thing. It's not. But that's neither here nor there. They tell the tale of Tom Cole, who of course committed suicide. And they pretty much put all the bullet points from Tom Cole's run-in into this situation. And this is pretty weird. You know, it's a very, very weird lawsuit. So ultimately, the Ring Boy scandal it's ongoing. Now it's an ongoing story. So all the hard work that people are putting in order to find it, to get it in front of the courts, it ought to be interesting to see how this one turns out. It ought to just be like $100 million or something, of which the law firm is going to take like 30 million of it. But the John Does, now It says John Doe number 1 is a citizen of Massachusetts. John Doe number 2 is a citizen of Massachusetts. John Doe 3 is a citizen of Pennsylvania. John Doe 4 is a citizen of Florida. And John Doe number 5 is a citizen of Pennsylvania. So none of the John Does are citizens of Maryland. They would then have the unfortunate task of proving that they were victimized in Maryland. Now, they try to make the argument that the state of Maryland should care about pretty much child molestation anywhere, which is a legitimate concern. But it says venue is proper in this court, as no single venue is applicable to all defendants, but all may be sued in a county in which any one of them could be sued, or in a county where the cause of action arose. A substantial part of the events giving rise to plaintiffs' claims occurred in Baltimore County. During the relevant time period, WWE shows were routinely held in Maryland, which was one of the company's key locations from the earliest days of McMahon's ownership, and each plaintiff was sexually abused in Maryland. WWE routinely held shows in Baltimore, Maryland, and Landover, Maryland, during the relevant time period of this complaint. Maryland has a substantial interest in resolving the issues of child sexual abuse that occurred within its borders, regardless of the citizenry or residence of the abused child or the alleged abusers. I agree with that. The issue here is, how do you prove, let's say John Doe number 3, because they go into some of the Mel Phillips wrestling with these guys, putting his hands on them inappropriately. I'm not going to go through all that. It's disgusting. But how would you prove with hard evidence that one of these people was molested in Maryland 40 years ago? Like, this is a very sticky subject that is just settlement bait. It's just much better to just pay this off and go away and just put it in your rearview mirror. Because dragging this thing in front of a trial, they're only going to bring up a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with this, which is what they're doing already. And it's horrifying to try to put people through all of this stuff and say, okay, now you have to prove as the plaintiff that you were taken from your home in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or Florida and brought to Maryland. How would you go about proving that actually occurred? Do you have pictures of yourself in a venue that is in Maryland? I don't know. It's very weird, and it seems very stressful too. I hope this does not turn out like that dumbass reparations lawsuit, where the attorneys were being predatory. They just wrap some people up and say, we're going to go sue the state of Oklahoma, only for it to get thrown out. And then they got dragged in front of the TV. Justice was denied our venerable elders for the Tulsa Race Massacre and all this kind of stuff. I don't want that happening to these folks, man. I don't like this being politicized either. It's all in Rolling Stone. Donald Trump's name is attached to it for no apparent fucking reason outside of Linda McMahon works for him. Worked on his political action committee. Trump has nothing to do with this. And that's the reason I think all of this stuff is happening, is because Trump is getting very close to winning the election and they don't want Trump to win. So they're like, whatever we got to do, pedophile rings, rape, whatever. But this did happen. There were children that were molested by this guy, even if it was just him playing with their feet. He was getting off on it. So it was sexual, at least to him. I am also more disgusted that the fact that the fucking federal government supposedly had a videotape of him doing it and did nothing. He should have been sitting in a federal prison this entire fucking time. But he wasn't, because the feds didn't do anything. So now we got to wait 40 years well, technically a little over 30, for the state of Maryland to provide redress to these people when the federal government were supposedly in possession of a tape over this whole thing in 1992. Sick shit. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you folks later.
No one does it better.